Hello, my name is Christian. I am a costume maker, a costume designer, and a creator of all things creative, if that makes any sense. Anyway, I decided to make this series of videos about sewing and working with fabrics to kind of demystify some of the ideas around sewing and costume construction. I think a lot of people get scared at the idea of sewing and using a sewing machine and sewing with a needle and thread and that sort of thing, and it can be intimidating. And so I want to sort of bring some practical ideas, tell you why the way we do the things that we do, the practices that we have in making costumes, and so this is the first video in that series, and you're in luck because it's the most important thing to talk about when you're talking about working with fabric. When you're talking about working with woven fabrics, the most important thing to keep in mind, in my opinion, is grain. So, what is grain? Well, when we talk about like the grain of wood, right, it's like the direction that the fibers are aligned in the wood. I'm not a carpenter, but grain is important to carpenters and furniture makers. When we talk about stone, it's also sort of the lines of stone, like the sort of sedimentary lines. If you're working with sedimentary rock, or any rock, I believe, has a grain to it. And stone masons and sculptors have to worry about the grain of stone. Even chefs, when they're working with different kinds of meat, they're thinking about the grain of the meat when they're cutting it with their knives. And in that same way, we think about the grain of fabric when we're working with fabrics. So, for fabrics, the grain is determined when the fabric is born. When I was in 3rd grade, I want to say, there was this object in the corner of the classroom that some kids would go up to and play with for a little bit, get disinterested in, and then walk away from. And that object was a loom. It was a yarn loom. And I don't know if you had one of these in your classroom, but I did. It was made of wood. It was, about the size of, a microwave. And it looked like lots of moving parts to it. But the thing that dominated its form were these parallel yarns, these parallel threads of yarn, all going sort of towards you if you were sitting at it. And then your job to operate it was to take this one yarn that was on this separate piece of wood and kind of put it through the parallel pieces, the parallel yarns, and then there was some sort of mechanism. I don't quite remember how you made it operate, but it would switch the yarns and then you'd pass it through the other way. So this yarn loom in my classroom was my first exposure to how fabric is made. And that's how fabric is made today, but on a huge industrial scale. Instead of it being this small little wooden machine in the corner of a classroom, whole buildings are taken up by these immense looms. Some of them are 10 feet wide and go all the way up to the ceiling, some 30, 40 feet high, running thousands of threads parallel at the same time, and with that shuttle going back and forth so fast that you can't even see it. If you want a pop culture reference to what this looks like, in the movie Wanted, part of that movie takes place in a industrial looming facility, an industrial fabric making facility, and at one point one of the characters is trying to catch the shuttle that's going back and forth too fast to even see. So, why is this important? This is important because when the fabric is being made, it's actually, that's when the grain is being created, and the fabric remembers that birth. And what I mean by that is, imagine this huge industrial machine with all these parallel threads, and there's an immense amount of tension on all of those threads. And this shuttle's going back and forth, super fast, and things are happening at an intense speed, but all the while, in order for it to work, the parallel threads are all under an immense amount of tension, and the machine is slowly rolling up the finalized fabric as it comes off the loom, right? So it starts out as all these parallel threads with one thread going back and forth for the most basic fabrics, right? And as it comes off the loom, it's being rolled onto a roller. And all during that time, all those parallel threads, which we call the warp threads, are all under tremendous tension. And after the fabric is done being made, the fabric wants to be in that same alignment that it was when it was made. So whatever forces are being applied to your costume, or your fashion, or whatever it is you're making out of fabric, whatever forces are being applied to it, what they are fighting against is that birth, is that grain that was created, and the fabric's desire and tendency to want to be straight like it was when it was born. So, for example, the primary force that our clothing fights is like gravity. So tailors and seamstresses and whoever's making clothing keeps grain in mind almost subconsciously, knowing that gravity is pulling down on your clothing. And in order for it to look straight and not wrinkly and symmetrical, you want that grain to be going with gravity. For a practical example, like my shirt here, the grain of the body of the shirt is going up to down, is going from the heavens to the center of the earth, just like gravity. And that helps keep the shirt looking straight and symmetrical and flat and nice. However, the sleeves of my shirt, though you can't really see it well on this particular shirt, the sleeves are cut with the grain going this way, not this way, because most of us carry our arms in a downward position most of the time. And as different silhouettes have developed over time, perhaps that seems like a small detail, but when you consider like a big voluptuous sleeve, some sort of greatly detailed opulent sleeve of the past, that idea that gravity is going down with your sleeve as your arms are down, it makes more sense. When I was an undergrad learning these things, one of the experiments that we did is we created 2 identical skirts. And maybe this is something we can do on the channel if you're interested. We made 2 identical skirts. One we cut on grain, that is with gravity pulling in the direction that the fabric was made. And the other skirt we made on the cross grain, 90 degrees off of that. So if you think of a skirt as basically being a tube, one tube had the tendency to be with gravity and there was no conflict. And the other tube, the other skirt, really it didn't want to be wrapped around a body, it wanted to be flat. And the result of this experiment was we made the 2 identical skirts, we let them hang on identical dress forms overnight, we came back for the next class, maybe it was a couple of days, but the skirt that we made on grain had a tendency to hang with the body, that sort of clung to the body. It wasn't clingy so much as it just, gravity obviously was pulling it, and it had sort of a weight to it, sort of a nice drape to that skirt. Whereas the skirt that was cut on the cross grain, that skirt, the skirt that really wanted to not be a skirt at all but wanted to be a flat thing, it had the tendency to have some puff to it. It didn't want to be against the body, it didn't want to be wrapped around anything. And so if you can imagine that, and again, this might be a good experiment to do for the channel, that is one of the practical impacts of grain. So if we go down this rabbit hole of grain, you can see that things like symmetry are going to be affected by grain. If you cut one half of a shirt on grain so that the fabric wants to be running this way, so it wants to be flat in this direction, but you cut the other half on the cross grain so that the tendency for it to be flat is in this direction, then when other forces are drawn upon it, even if it looks fine on the dress form, when you start wearing it and you start moving, you will see that the 2 sides will be in conflict. They won't look the same. And that kind of asymmetry is usually something you don't want in your fashion or your costumes or anything that you're making out of fabric. Another thing about grain versus the cross grain versus being completely off grain is that the stretch of fabric, even the most tightly woven fabrics, have a little bit of stretch on the cross grain, and I'll show you why that is in a moment. and tend to not be very stretchy on grain. And again, I'll explain that in just one second. And so that kind of conflict, that there's a little bit of stretch going in one direction, but in the other direction there's no stretch, that can also show once the person starts moving and other forces besides gravity start playing a role. So that's another thing, another reason why we care about grain. Alright, so hopefully you're convinced that grain is kind of important, and now we're going to go to the next step, which is how to identify the grain. Alright, so here, just as our first example, I have I have a whole bolt of muslin, permanent press muslin. This is 100% cotton. This is what we use to make mock-ups and sort of prototypes for costumes. And it has a grain. It's a woven fabric, and just like any woven fabric, it's made, like we said about the yarn loom, it's made on a huge industrial loom. So how are we going to identify the grain on this? Well, one of the reasons why we choose muslin to make mock-ups is because the grain is pretty clear on muslin as opposed to other fabrics. You can look and see the interwoven threads pretty well on muslin. Now we've got, we already talked about how the long ways, the grain fabrics are called the warp. And the one thread that goes back and forth, that's usually called the weft or the woof. I think woof is pretty antiquated and literary. Like I think Melville uses the word woof in Moby Dick when describing fabric. But you can use either interchangeably. I'll try to use weft. The woof is so fun to say. Alright, so how do we going to identify the grain if we had no idea? Well, first of all, when you buy fabric, it comes either on a bolt or on a roll, and you buy it by the yard, or I suppose by the meter in other countries. I'm not sure. I'm from America, and we use yards and inches and such. So when you buy that fabric, it comes by the yard, and when you purchase it on the yard, usually, almost always, if you buy 2 yards of fabric, those 2 yards are on grain, meaning the length of it is the grain. So that's one easy way. As you start unrolling your fabric, you can know that the grain is going longwise, that when fabric is made, as I described, it's getting rolled onto a big roller as it's being created. All that tension is happening along the length of the fabric longwise, and so that is the grain. The long threads are the grain, whereas the one that goes back and forth, that's the cross grain. All right. So, but what else? You're not always going to have your fabric from the fabric store, and you might get less yardage than it is wide, and then I would be steering you in the wrong direction to think that, oh, if you only have 18 inches wide of fabric, then that must mean that the grain goes this way. No, there's other things you should be looking for. The next easiest thing to look for is what's called the salvage edge. The salvage edge is where that single thread turns around and goes back the other way, and it's also where the machine that winds the finished fabric onto the roll often makes little perforation marks or some other indication of its having been there. On this fabric, this muslin doesn't have any indication of that process, but let me show you a piece of fabric that does. Here on this fabric, you can see that it's got a couple of different indicators of its salvage edge. One are those little holes I was talking about that are part of the putting on the roll process as it's coming off the loom. Those little holes are created by the machine, and that's a good indicator. And also, a lot of fabrics tend to change the weave to a much tighter weave towards the edge of the salvage edge, and this is usually for that process. They want something nice and tight and strong for those teeth to grab into as it's winding the fabric. And so you'll see that a lot also, is sort of that change from the sort of standard weave into a tighter, less stretchy weave for the machine to be able to do its job. Here's another piece of fabric. This one, I mean, has this practice sewing thread in it, which might be a distraction. But this is a good example of how the print ended. The print ends on this one too, and it has that sort of cool numbers that are the different dye values that they are using to create the print. That's a good indicator. If the print stops and has, you know, words on it that aren't part of the pattern, then that is the salvage edge, and the grain runs parallel to that edge. So the same thing's happening on here. The pattern ends, there's sort of this edge that's on this one. It has that frayed edge, which might make you think, oh, that can't be the salvage edge, because we're talking about one that turns around this way. But when you're working with different sorts of prints and different threads, sometimes it'll have that sort of fuzzy edge. The real indicator here is how the print stops and how it's got that tighter weave towards the edge. And I'm just going to find sort of random fabric over here. On this random piece of fabric, I can find the salvage edge. Can you see it? It has that tighter weave right through there. And so it's got that tighter weave. There's no little holes or anything like that. The pattern does in fact end at that edge. Oh, well, nope, that was a coincidence. The pattern does not end. But I can recognize that as the grain because it has that finished. There's no threads loose pulling, and it's got that tighter weave. As opposed to the other edge, even if you have a fabric like our blue fabric that has that sort of frayed edge to it, it has a very different nature than the frayed edge that is not the grain, that is not the salvage edge. This is the edge of the fabric, and you can see that that is coming off. Even this, we can create an area that has that same fringy quality, but we also have these long cut weft thread areas here. So hopefully you can find the salvage edge. That's the point of this, because the salvage edge is a really good indicator of the direction that the fabric was made, and the direction that the fabric was made is the grain. Alright, so let's say you have a piece of fabric though where the salvage edge has been cut off and they really have no indicator that the way the fabric was made. Well, this goes back to what I was talking about stretch. When the fabric is being made, remember, there's all that tension going along the grain, and there's one thread in the simplest kinds of fabrics that's going back and forth. In that back and forth, it's really not going straight. The shuttle is going to go straight, but then the warp threads are kind of catching that straight thread in between their motion. And in doing that, if you looked under a microscope, you would see that the weft thread, that the single thread on the shuttle, is actually doing a little bit of a sort of wave motion going back and forth between those two, between the warp threads. And because of that, most fabrics that are woven have a little bit of give and stretch along the cross grain that is in line with that that weft thread, as opposed to along the grain where it is usually very tight and there's no stretch going along the grain. Now I have to say usually because in 2019 there's lots of fabrics that use fibers that are stretchy by nature, and people can be tricky in using one kind of fiber and one kind of thread for the warp threads, and a different kind of fiber and a different kind of thread for the weft thread. And so sometimes you will come across woven fabrics which are stretchy on grain, but as a rule, what we would say like a non-stretchy fabric, a non-stretchy textile, something that isn't designed to have much stretch to it, will still have some stretch along the cross grain and then not any along the grain. Okay, so we've identified a few different ways to find the grain. well, the way you purchase it in length is on grain. The Salvage Edge is probably the easiest and fastest way to find your grain. Looking to see if there's stretch in one direction as opposed to the other. And then the final way is going to be to actually demonstrate that you have a single thread that is going back and forth. And that might require a close-up. Alright, we've zoomed in a little bit here to get a little bit more intimate so you can see what's going on. So here I have my muslin, and my hypothesis is that this is the grain. That the grain are these clearly indicated threads going this way, and that the cross grain is the 90 degrees from that. And if I'm right, that means that the cross grain is not in fact many hundreds of threads going this way, but is one thread going back and forth hundreds and hundreds of times, just like at the yarn loom. So if I'm right, I should be able to pull this thread. Let's try to get it in camera there. There we go. Should be able to pull this thread, and when I get to the corner, there's my corner. Here's the corner in frame. When I pull this thread, it should start to double back on itself. Proving. You gotta prove it. Prove it. There it goes. Proving. And now we've already gone back. I've already gone back on ourselves all the way to here. It's sometimes a little hard to get through the corner. This is all one thread now going back in the other direction, which proves that that is the weft thread, and that then the other direction is the warp, and the warp thread is the grain. So while I have you here up close, I also want to talk about, we don't always use fabric on grain, though that is the most common way that we cut in terms of fighting gravity, right? Is you want the body of the thing that you're wearing to be pulled on by gravity so that it is flat and straight. Some things are cut on the cross grain, usually in order to take advantage of the stretchiness of the cross grain or the not stretchiness of the grain. I think if you think of the back of a men's shirt, up at the top where your shoulders are is an area called the yoke, and usually that yoke wants to be stretchy going on the grain. So I guess that piece is cut on grain, but then the collar is cut so that it is stiffer and not stretchy going in the opposite direction. So you'll see a lot of time that a collar piece, which again, we want its fighting gravity to work with us, and so it will be more of a stand-up collar if it's cut the other way around, if it's cut so that the grain is going around the neck this way instead of this way. And that might be hard to visualize, and hopefully we'll get to that in a future episode. But then I did also want to talk about the bias, which is 45 degrees. This comes up in other crafts too. When you're working with wood, they talk about a bias cut of wood and the advantages and disadvantages of that. Well, in working with textiles, when you cut something on the bias so that the piece is pulled by gravity at a 45-degree angle, really what you're doing is defeating the structure of the grain entirely. Whenever you cut diagonally into fabric, it sort of defeats that strength of the grain substantially. And so, especially in the 30s, you'll see things starting to be cut unbiased, and that's part of that sort of slinky style that you think of in like Hollywood golden age slinky dresses, especially, is that they will have a quality to them, a drape to them, which is not the same as being pulled down by gravity, but has more of like a liquid quality to it. And that can partially be accomplished by cutting things on the bias, so that that structure is sort of defeated, and the fabric just sort of drapes around the person that's wearing it rather than fighting it. All right. So we talked about why grain is important, why things are cut the way they are, how grain was created in the first place, and we identified a few different ways to identify the grain before you start working with fabric. Now, I also wanted to mention that when you buy a store-bought pattern, the grain is going to be marked on all the pieces, meaning it's going to tell you how they want you to lay out the pieces on the fabric so that the grain is going the way that it makes sense for that particular piece. Usually things are going to be going with gravity. If you're doing a historic pattern, things might be different. If you're doing something that is trying to create a lot of volume, then it might use the cross grain a lot. If you're doing like a 30s dress or something that's very drapey, it might be cut on the bias. But it's definitely something that you need to pay attention to. It's not something you can ignore and place your pattern pieces however you want, however best fits on your piece of fabric. That is a recipe for disaster. So you want to be very careful about finding that grain. Now, once you found it and once you've laid out your fabric, then what do you do? I mean, how do you lay out a piece on grain? The easiest way to do it is to measure away from that grain in a couple of different places, measure to the grain line to make sure those two things are parallel. I'm going to show you how to do that right now. Alright, I don't know if you can see me here. Here I've got some fabric. I'm going to make some 4th of July, some Independence Day bell bottoms, I guess. This is a pretty old simplicity pattern of some hip hugger bell bottoms. This is just the side back piece. Oh no, it's the center back piece of these pants. And just like on all pattern pieces, unless it says on the fold, which means on the grain, unless it doesn't. But almost all pieces are going to have an arrow on them like this. This piece has this big blue arrow right here, and that is my grain line. That is the line that I want to be parallel to the grain, the line that I want to be parallel to those warp threads, so that gravity is pulling straight down the pant leg when the person who's wearing them is just standing there at rest. So how are we going to place this perfectly? Well, I've already placed my fabric pretty perfectly on my cutting surface. I'm going to cut these pants out with a rotary tool, and so I'm using one of these great mats that you can cut on without damaging the table. The drawback of doing that is that you can't pin it through the fabric into the table, which is one of the things I like to do to keep things from moving around. And so instead I'm using these big glass pattern weights to hold the fabric in place on grain on the cutting surface. And then I just need to place the pattern piece so it is also on grain on the cutting surface, and then I can trace around it and cut it out with the rotary tool. So here we go. Here's how this is going to work. We know the grain is parallel to the selvage edge, so I'm going to take a ruler. I like these clear rulers particularly, and I'm going to measure away from the selvage edge at the one side of the grain arrow here, and I'm going to move that up to, let's say, 8 inches right there. I'm going to put a weight, and then I'm going to measure from the edge of the fabric that same 8 inches. It's actually going to move this up to here. I'm going to measure right to the middle of the grain line because there's a pretty thick grain line on this old pattern. I'm going to put the weight right there, and I'm going to just come back to measure again back where it was originally, so I can make a tiny adjustment. That's pretty good. Alright, so once you have it lined up on grain, then you can throw down a couple other magnets in places that put down a couple other weights in places that make sense to hold down the corners. There you go, that's plenty of weight. Now I should be able to, I like to mark, I work in a costume shop, with lots of students at various different skill levels, and so I like to get them in the habit of tracing out the pieces first before cutting them. And when we do alterations and that sort of thing, it helps to have that finish line there also. Though if you're making something for yourself, something where you don't want that extra pencil line involved, then you can just cut right away. But we'll talk about cutting another time. I just wanted to show you how to make sure that your pieces were exactly on grain before you cut them. So now you should have a pretty good idea about how to do your layout on your fabric with your pattern pieces to make sure that everything is on grain. And that's really the most important thing, I think, in order to get something that looks really, really good. Why put all the effort into making something from homemade by hand? It takes a lot of work to make your own fashion, to make your own costumes, and every little bit that you can do to try to get that to be as accurate as possible, and putting yourself out on the right foot, that's going to make a big difference. So I hope you found this video useful. This is it, guys. Grain, super important. Once you understand why grain is the way it is, why it's important to us, and how to discover it and use it, then it's really going to take your sewing and your cutting especially up to the highest level. So I hope you found this video useful, and if so, let me know, and I'll see you next time.